Overheated and overfished. Oceans issuing an SOS from a summit in Nice. Try telling that, though, to those who advocate deep-sea drilling for precious metals. In a world hungry for the minerals that power our batteries and connect our computers, the United States, but also China, India, Japan, Norway, and more, are seriously studying whether science fiction can become reality and we can drill. We'll ask about the actual feasibility of deep-sea mining and the competing narratives at play, with the U.S. boycotting the United Nations Oceans Conference in Nice, and a paltry 32 nations so far ratifying the UN's High Seas Treaty. You need 60 for it to go into effect. How to protect the 2/3 of our planet's surface that belongs, I guess you could say, to both everyone and no one. On that score, no need to drill when you hit rock bottom. Even areas protected on paper remain vulnerable to large fishing trawlers that literally rake the seabed, killing both fish and plant life essential for our planet. What to do before it's too late? Today in the France 24 debate, are the oceans already locked in a race to the bottom? And with us is Juliette Tassé, who heads the Oceans program at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Iris, also co-author of Geopolitics of the Sea. Thank you for joining us from Nice.
Thank you very much.
With us as well, Paul Watson. You may recently made headlines when Denmark jailed him in a failed bid to extradite him in Japan, the founder of the anti-whaling organization of the same name. Thank you for joining us from your Sea Shepherd ship, which has dropped anchor in Nice.
Yes, that's true. We're here in Villefranche Bay attending the United Nations Conference on the Ocean.
With us as well from the French Riviera, Rachid Soumela, professor and Canada Research Chair in Ocean and Fisheries Economics at the University of British Columbia. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be together with all these panelists.
Alexei Povilecic is the CEO and president of the Paris Aquarium. And if you don't know where the Paris Aquarium is, well, just go across the street from the Eiffel Tower. Thanks for joining us.
Exactly. Hi.
On the go, by the way, you can always listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. So no Donald Trump on the French Riviera. The U.S. is boycotting. But some friends among the 60 heads of state and government present. There you see Javier Milei. No word on what the libertarian right-wing president of Argentina thought of the United Nations Secretary General, who in his speech sounded the alarm on deep-sea mining.
Nations are now addressing navigating new waters on seabed mining. I support the ongoing work of the International Seabed Authority on this important issue. The deep sea cannot become the Wild West.
The Wild West? The Wild West, Alexei Povilevich, or outer space? Because we've heard in the last few days scientists explain to us we know more about the moon than we do about places that are below the ocean floor.
Yes, one of the main issues with the ocean is that we depend highly on the ocean, on the quality of life on Earth. It's evident 70% of the planet is covered with water. So what's happening with us on Earth depends highly on what's in the ocean. But we have never developed knowledge about what's in there, really. For instance, you have satellites that can tell you the surface of the water, but the deep sea, nobody has been there very often. Look, when we are building a new electric wire between France and Ireland, 2 years of that are just digging in the bottom of the sea just to know how it is. And it's the channel that they're crossing. So you can imagine in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific, nobody knows what's in there. So the reason why, before doing anything, we should first spend time and money and energy to just better understand what's there at the bottom.
All right, Emmanuel Macron, we're going to hear him perhaps during this hour speaking. He addressed the opening of this UN conference. He'll be calling for exploration for scientific purposes, but a moratorium on drilling. Should be noted, France, also the UK and Germany, among the European nations currently exploring, for instance, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. That's a vast expanse of the Pacific that's currently administered by the International Seabed Authority. Let me ask you, Paul Watson, that's an area that's, just to be clear, to the west of Mexico, in the middle of the Pacific, and it's huge. The notion even of exploring the ocean, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Exploring the ocean, nothing wrong with that. But when you start extracting ferromanganese nodules from the seabed, that is going to cause some significant ecological damage, and that we have to avoid.
Do you, when you're out on the open sea, do you wonder about what's below?
Well, we do know to a certain extent what is below, and on the bottom we have an incredibly complex ecosystem with thousands of species that are in very delicate environment. Something like seabed mining can seriously disrupt that ecosystem. But also when you bring these nodules up to the surface and you extract them and you dump the sediment back, that sediment then descends through the depths, leaching oxygen from the ocean, putting elements into the ocean which don't belong there, and suffocating life on the benthic floor. And those sediment drifts can go for literally hundreds and hundreds of miles around that area, and can take up to a couple of years to reach the bottom as they drift around.
All right, so at the same time, and this is, what's been making headlines, we have, for instance, this Canadian firm, the Metals Company, making headlines in April. Donald Trump signed an executive order asserting that the U.S. was entitled to issue licenses to mine in international waters. And with banking from Wall Street firm Cantor Fitzgerald, whose former boss is the current U.S. Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, the company has now, as you can hear, the wind in its sails.
I mean, how important for you personally and for your company is it to be the first to mine?
It's not important, but it's a fact that we will be.
So you have absolutely no doubt that you will be the first?
No doubt.
All right, that's one company, the Metals Company. Also in the race, another a U.S. firm called Impossible Metals. Now, it insists it can do environmentally friendly drilling.
We're developing underwater robotics that will pick up these nodules, which are these rocks that are deep into the ocean. We have developed technology that will pick these up in a selective way where the robot stays hovering over the seafloor as we pick up these nodules. The vision system on the vehicle identifies life, leaves life undisturbed, and also leaves a proportion of nodules completely undisturbed as we pass over them. That way we ensure we maintain the function of the ecosystem.
Julietas, is he telling pies there, or can they really have an eco-friendly way of picking these nodules from the seabed?
I would be curious to know what's the technology he's talking about is. Actually, one point to have in mind is that as Alexis said, there is a difference between the surface of the sea and the deep sea. And there is a very big difference, which is our capacity to operate in the deep sea. So all these companies are saying that they have the ability to go down to 4,000, maybe 5,000 meters deep, which is, it's really costly first. It has a lot of technical challenges. So I'd be curious to know how they actually make sure that they are not destroying biodiversity, because it's already difficult to reach those depths. So how can you make sure, with which kind of surveillance capacity do you make sure that you did not impact the biodiversity? And this is also one question that is very available for all the governance framework that we're discussing at the moment. Who is in charge of surveilling and with which kind of operating capacity?
And who is in charge?
Well, so there is a difference that's so I was talking about the difference between the surface of the sea and the water column. So there is a difference also in terms of framework between the water column and the seabed. So you mentioned the International Seabed Authority. And this is an agency of the UN that is in charge of managing what is called the area, which is all the place of the seabed that does not belong or is under the jurisdiction of any state. So it's basically the seabed that is under international waters. So there is a specific agency of the UN in charge of managing this area. This agency is also the place where we have negotiation at the moment in terms of deep sea mining. Now, who will be in charge? This is not only a question of framework, this is also a question of technology. So this might be something that will rely on specific states, for example, that have the technology. But this is very much of a question that I don't have the answer to, because it's what we're discussing at the moment. The number of stakeholders that are able to go that deep in the ocean is really limited.
But those stakeholders have money and power. We talk about the United States, we talk about China, and the such. Rashid Soumaila, is it a losing battle trying to stop these schemes to drill the ocean floor?
Yeah, it's a difficult challenge, right? Like you said, the powerful and the rich are pushing for this. And but you know what? If you look throughout history, somehow the larger global population has been able to push back. So there is a potential for us to be able to push back. I am an economist, and I know the economic edge to grab anything, turn it into money. But this system, the deep sea, is so complicated that, I mean, if we just go in there without the knowledge, it's quite scary, actually. Some of the animals there live very long, 500, 400 years. The Greenland shark lives. And they are very economic, more economic than the companies that are trying to go in there in order to survive. There's little life, there's little food. And so going in there without the knowledge is just unbelievable. And we have been looking at the data. There's really very, very little. All the studies, most of them just look at the revenue and the cost, which is the financial side. They don't look at the total economic value of valuation, as we say in environmental economics. And when you look at that, it doesn't look good at all in terms of even the economics.
So Rashid, and by the way, we're looking at live images of the family photo of the world leaders that are gathered there in Nice, where you are. What's it all about? What was that announcement in April by the U.S., that decree, or sorry, that executive order signed by Donald Trump all about?
Yeah, you know, that executive order actually is not yet made into law. So that's the U.S. president saying, look, we allow it not only in U.S. waters, but also in the high seas, in the place that is actually supposed to be managed, the area, by the International Seabed Authority. And, you know, powerful countries do what they like, but I want to say to the companies, they just have to watch out, right? Because it's a global thing. The world has put out an institute to look at this, make sure we don't harm the environment, and that whatever is taking the money is also shared among countries that cannot go down there but have a stake in there, like the developing world. If you go out because you have a favorable government and you go in there, watch out what the rest of the world may do. People may not buy your minerals, for example. Or politics is a renewable resource, like Al Gore will say. Things can change, and the favorable government can also go. Nothing is permanent. So for me, it's a little caution to the companies. Just because you can ride on now, you have to think a bit more medium, long term in your business if you are really going to be part of the global community.
The fact, Paul Watson, that the United States is absent in Nice, is that a hindrance or a major hindrance for you?
Well, the United States has no authority to go and extract and exploit in international waters. One of the things that we really want to see happen here is the ratification of the High Seas Treaty. We need 60 countries to sign and ratify that treaty. So far, only 28. And of the larger countries, only France and Chile and Portugal and Panama. And the U.S., of course, like Japan and Russia and North Korea and Australia, haven't ratified it. But and those are the countries that seem to have a vested interest in exploitation. But what we're prepared to go out there and interfere directly with any exploitive operations that are not legal under a high seas treaty.
Yeah, just tell for our viewers, please, why ratifying that high seas treaty matters.
If we have the high seas treaties, that means that we will be able to have enforcement in international waters to uphold international conservation law, and that means overfishing or any kind of exploitive activity. It'd be very, very important for us to do that. Right now, it's the Wild West out there. You can do anything you want because there's a lack of economic and political motivation to uphold international conservation law. So that high seas treaty will give authority to the United Nations to enforce those laws.
All right, among those present in Nice, one of the countries that has yet to ratify, Brazil, but whose president promises there'll be good news on that front very soon.
Hidden interests are preventing the creation of the South Atlantic Whale Sanctuary. Brazil is committed to ratifying the High Seas Treaty this year to include the transparent and shared management of biodiversity and national borders.
Julia Tass, the idea in this High Seas Treaty is that it encompasses several facets.
So what's interesting, maybe also building on what has been said before by Paul Watson, is that Nice is a conference that is taking place every few years that has the very much advantage of gathering, well, all the people working on the maritime issues, but also all the different frameworks that are ruling the seas. So we've been talking about the deep sea, and we've been talking about the International Seabed Authority, which is one framework. There is another one discussed, this biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, so the High Seas Treaty. It can seem very weird to have so many different frameworks discussed, but actually they're very much intrigued. So for example, if you, as Paul Watson said, if you have one way to make sure or to enforce that the BBNJ treaty, the High Sea Treaty, you also have a way to protect biodiversity down on the seabed. The ocean is one physical space. We fragmented it as human, but this is one physical space. So the idea is to gather all here to have all this framework in coherence. So now, what is at stake in this High Sea Treaty is both the fact that we can implement marine protected areas in the high seas. So this is what Paul Watson has been discussing, but also all kind of environmental evaluation tools that are enabling stakeholders to understand which activities have which impacts. And we're talking with the High Sea Treaty of activities that, for example, are relying on marine genetic resources. So marine genetic resources are becoming much more important now that we have tools with DNA, for example, to extract proteins and molecules that are interesting for cosmetics or pharmaceutical industries. So before those resources were not so interesting for the industry, now they're becoming interesting much more and more. So this is also something that is discussed along with, for example, fishing practices during this conference.
Alexei Povilevich, it brings us back to what you were saying at the outset of our conversation, which is how little we know about the ocean. And again, is it just human nature's temptation to first explore, marvel, and then find some utilitarian use, as Julia Tass was hinting at just there?
No, that's naturally what happened. And when you think that it has only been since, 3 to 5 years that we went from hunting to farming in the seas. Now we grow more food from the seas than we fish it, thanks to the extraordinary Mekong shrimp business. But that's very important. And then we know that this evolution has created huge environmental stress on coastal areas affected by this over farming of fish. Look at what is happening in the fjords of Norway, etc. So indeed, we start to better control what we can do with the ocean. We are taking more and more food out of it, and we need to take food out of the ocean because we need to feed the people on Earth. That's very important. But there is minimum research, for instance, on benthic areas. And the trophic nests around the benthos, that's the bottom of the sea, is not known. And I know as an aquarium, you have 100 big aquariums in the world. We are one of them, and we are one of the 2 or 3 that's looking at this kind of things. It's very tiny animals that live together. It's just the origin of life, including on Earth, and nobody is studying that. So I was listening what you were saying, but plastics, for instance, are a major issue on which we have far more, on which we can be far more hand-on than on nodule hunting, Plastics are everywhere. And it's in Geneva, I think 6 months from now, that it will be the 6th session. They are not able to even control the plastic issue. All the 80% of the plastics end up in the seas. They are forming a 7th continent in the middle of the Pacific. Paul Watson may talk to you about it because he saw it. I didn't. This is a massive problem. It's even more important than drilling or nodule mining.
And so a high seas treaty, would it matter? Because I guess I'm going to ask you a variation on the question I put earlier to Rashid Soumaila, which is, we're in this period now where people are walking away from multilateral organizations, turning their backs on the World Trade Organization to a degree. And a high seas treaty.
Exactly.
How would it be
even more? There are not many states that are taking part in the treaty, and the US is out. And imagine even the US signed but doesn't respect it. What do we do? So it's Paul Watson who is right then. We have to be activists. But I admire Paul Watson's legacy and his current activities. But the impact, really the impact on government is minimum. And the stress to the ocean is worldwide. I was astonished by the declarations of our ambassador, French ambassador to the poles, who just said before the conference that we should not be afraid because people living around the coastlines were taking care of the ocean. That's not true. When you go to Tokyo, when you go to London, when you go to even Brest in France or Marseille, people don't care about the ocean. The aquariums try to become informal education institutions. We try to educate people about the importance of ocean. Paul Watson is doing that with his own activist way. He has been doing that all his life. And he must be, like me, astonished by the fact that still today people don't understand. They don't understand that what's happening on Earth ends up in the ocean. But if the ocean goes wrong, we are in a terrible mess. I mean, the quality of our living standards on Earth depend highly on the quality of the oceans.
When it comes to that public awareness, Paul Watson, would you say that the glass is half empty or half full when you look back at your decades of activism?
Well, there's a lot of awareness, and there's more awareness now than ever before, but how do you translate that awareness into political activism? One of the most serious things facing our ocean is that since 1950, there's been a 40% diminishment in phytoplankton in the sea. Phytoplankton provides up to 70% of the oxygen in the air we breathe. Seabed mining, for example, will actually have a significant impact on phytoplankton. And here's the reality. If phytoplankton disappears from the sea, we die. We do not live on this planet without it. So if the ocean dies, we die with it. So this is probably we have an incredible obligation and responsibility to do everything we can to protect diversity and interspecies relations in that biodiversity. If we don't, then the problem is going to get more and more serious with very, very dire consequences.
And on the issue of plastics that was just broached there by Alexis?
Yeah, well, plastic pollution is a major, major problem. We see it everywhere, but the worst part is it's being broken down into nanoplastics, which gets into plankton, it gets into fish. And I can tell you right now, anybody who's eaten fish has got nanoplastics in their bodies. It is going to be more and more of a serious health problem, and it has to be addressed. We can no longer continue to deny the fact that we're killing ourselves by killing the ocean.
Do you eat fish?
No, absolutely not.
Rashid Soumaila, do you eat fish?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I do eat fish, and you know, I'm West African. You know, there are people who say we shouldn't eat fish, but when I look at parts of the world, you know, if you are in Canada or France, you can choose not to eat fish. But there are many people in West Africa they have no animal protein if not for fish. In Southeast Asia also. So we have to apply that differently, right? I think people in the West, including me, should at the minimum consider fish as medicine almost for the macronutrients, not to eat it to fill your stomach, but it has to be some ceremoniality. And then there are parts of the world, until we help the rest of the world to become rich enough, they will have no option but to eat fish. So that is where I stand with that. My background informs me a lot because I know what is happening to millions of people in West Africa along the coast.
So is the ocean big enough?
Of all the fish caught, sorry.
Go ahead, Paul Watson.
40% of all the fish that's caught is turned in, 40% of all the fish that's caught is turned into fish meal, which is fed to chickens and pigs and domestic salmon. It's not eaten by people. It's industrialized fishing, which is destroying our ocean. Nobody wants to stop people in West Africa or the Philippines from going out and catching fish. But those giant super trawlers, those 100-kilometer gill nets, 100-kilometer long lines, we are literally destroying the ocean through industrialized fishing. And, you know, this has got nothing to do with people who need fish for a living. We certainly don't need to feed it to chickens, to pigs, and to salmon.
Well, that was an issue, Paul Watson, when I was a West Africa correspondent decades ago already. We saw the trawlers off the coast doing that. Why has there been no progress on this?
Why has there been no progress? Because, again, there's a lack of political and economic motivation to do anything.
Let me bring you in on this, Rashid Soumaila.
Yeah, and this is a very good point. I mean, so we talk a lot about small scale coastal versus the large scale. And subsidies, we haven't talked about that. Government money going to West Africa or to go to the Pacific and take their fish, right? So that's when we did the estimate, 80% of all government subsidies go to large-scale industry. And that really takes fish out of the mouths of people who need it. And it's also gender really discriminates because most women who fish on small boats, not on the large ones, right? So you discriminate the youth, women, right, and people who need their fish. This is really important. We have to boost small-scale fishing and really discourage as much as we can large-scale industrial fishing. Because like Paul says, most of the products goes to feed pigs and other things rather than people, so.
Alexis Povilajic.
Just to make things clear, 800 million people live on coastal fisheries. Those people do not have any alternative. The problem is that even France, at the Kerguelen Islands, has the utmost difficulties to have fishing rights respected by a fleet of people coming. I mean, official ship come, and then we perfectly know that even in France, around the Kerguelen Islands, you have illegal fisheries going on. Can you imagine off the coast of a country of Western Africa without a navy? The situation is very, very, very dear, and you have not very. We may not sound very optimistic, but what we know from the outside world is not very bright.
Julia Tass, what can this conference do to move this forward?
So there have been recent interesting points I have to highlight, even though as the other panelists, I consider the situation to be quite dire. So for example, the international or the World Trade Organization has discussed the end of those subsidies that Dr. Soumeida talked about. So the subsidies that are subsidizing, overfishing, let's say, not illegal fishing, but overfishing. There have been discussion, and the different countries agreed on the end of those subsidies. But now, who is really acting towards the end of these subsidies? Because each country has to have political discussion with its fishermen, and it's very difficult to get out of this industrial fishing economy that has been actually quite generalized over the world. And it means that you take out the privilege of some big companies, for example. The discussion that we're having about industrial fishing and artisanal small-scale fishing is also relevant in European countries, and I would say also in Northern American countries. We also have in Europe small-scale fishermen and industrial fishermen. So the idea now is to find a solution at the political level. And as Paul Watson underlined, it's not always easily done, or it lacks political willingness.
So, Julia Tass, how do you rate Emmanuel Macron, the host of this conference, and France's policy? Because France has, again, it's got a big coastline, biggest in the European Union, and it's got both of what you described. Small fishermen and industrial fishermen.
So there is one big challenge for France, the fact that fishing is a competence of the European Union. So that is one huge factor that makes it very difficult also for the French government to implement whatsoever fishing policy it could have. As for the presidency of Emmanuel Macron, so there have been announcements a few days ago about marine protected areas in France, and you might have noticed that at the moment the marine protected areas in France do not forbid deep sea, the use of some fishing practices that are really devastating for the environment. So this is kind of an incoherence, because you have protected areas which still authorize some very devastating fishing practices. So that is one thing we should address. The second part would also be to discuss with our neighbors at the European level, industrial fishing, because the Netherlands, for example, or Spain are huge fishing countries as well. And we could also discuss the fishing agreements that the European Union has with West African countries, among others, because they could also have very harmful impact on the environment. So there is different scales. I'm not saying this is easy, and not saying either that Emmanuel Macron really showed until this week fishing sustainability as a priority.
Paul Watson, that brings us back to what you were describing earlier, that when treaties don't work, that's when you have to have calls to action. In this regards, when it comes to this industrial fishing, where do you start?
Well, the United Nations World Charter for Nature allows for non-government organizations and individuals to intervene, especially in areas beyond national jurisdiction. A high seas treaty would give us even more strength to do that. So if the governments of the world are not willing or are not going to take responsibility for protecting biodiversity on the high seas, it will fall to non-government organizations to do that. And we will operate within the boundaries of the law. We will operate non-violently, but we must take action in order to protect our ocean.
If there was a high seas treaty that was ratified by more than 60 nations, would that have meant that you personally would not have spent 3 months in a jail in Greenland for a charge from Japan that dates back to 2012?
Well, that was 5 months, but the reason I was there had nothing to do with anything that I did other than that I had a television show which embarrassed and humiliated the Japanese government. So my weapon in that case was a camera, and they didn't like what I was portraying. Their illegal fishing, whaling operations in the Southern Ocean whale sanctuary. And that's not my opinion. That was the judgment of the International Court of Justice in The Hague.
So what would the High Seas Treaty have changed? Nothing or something when it comes to this red notice that was put out?
Well, first of all, these red notices are, Interpol is weaponizing these red notices to go after whistleblowers and dissidents and activists, and we have to put an end to that. We've been publicizing this as best we can. It just has to stop. I mean, these things were, red notices were meant to go after war criminals, serial killers, major drug traffickers. I have a red notice for obstructing business in the Southern Ocean against a criminal enterprise that was killing whales in violation of international law.
Criminal enterprise is actually a key word because there are actual, in some cases, Rashid Soumela, I'll put it to you, organized crime involved on the high seas.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about modern slavery, actually, the kind of treatment that people who are trapped in these boats on the high sea, what they go through is simply inhuman. You don't do that to people, at least not in 2025, okay? But that is happening in the high sea. There's a lot of illegal fishing. In fact, there's a little paper I did, I say, a fish called subsidies and a fish called illegal fish, where 1/3 of the fish you eat is actually probably caught illegally. And so, yes, there's a lot of criminality going out there. That is why some of us have actually called for banning fishing in the high seas completely, and also banning deep sea mining. All these extractive, most of the fish are actually on the continental shelf. The fish they go out in the high seas to catch are tunas, and they go in and out of the high seas. So we can wait for them and catch them without pumping CO2, without killing orphans of the ocean, the delicate fish, and also making the fish more available to smaller countries when the fish come in, like Guinea-Bissau or Bangladesh. Is good for the world because we have people being able to live where in their own place, not being forced to migrate. Forced migration, Europeans know this very well. But if we want to stop that, walls cannot stop that. What will stop it is making life livable everywhere. And that means we don't take the fish out of the mouth of people just because they are not that powerful or rich.
Julieta, on this point, if these marine protected areas that you described earlier, are they bearing fruit? Are they bearing results? Or as you described it, are trawlers just coming in and raking the seabed there anyway?
Well, I'm not a scientist in an ecological science, but yes, marine protected areas are of course bearing fruits. You asked the question earlier about whaling and illegal fishing or illegal fishing as a whole, and the BBNG Treaty, so the High Sea Treaty. The High Sea Treaty does not there is nothing about fishing in the High Sea Treaty. It's really about marine genetic resources, because fishing is such a big topic already that we don't need an additional treaty to have this topic discussed. At the moment, the difficulty is really to have already marine protected areas in areas that are under jurisdiction respected. Illegal fishing, as Professor Soumela said, is taking place, in the high sea, of course, but also in the exclusive economic zones, so the zones that are under jurisdiction of states. So the ability of states to have their own area and their own rules respected is already something that should be improved. The marine protected areas that are based in those state-ruled zone have very, very positive impact on biodiversity when fishing is actually respecting the rules. Of course, it's very difficult to measure the impact of a marine protected area if there is illegal fishing taking place, because you don't know how much illegal fishing has been taking place. per se, if it's illegal, it's very difficult to follow, to surveil, and to understand. So there is no need to have more data. I think we have enough data to know that marine protected areas are a solution, but there is also a question of, as we said, political willingness to discuss the treaty and the frameworks, but also to implement and to enforce law. And that is where we have not only a question of political willingness, but also of political means, because we have to get the means, the ships, the personnel, in order to forbid illegal fishing to take place.
Paul Watson, please give us a good news story.
Yeah.
Are there areas where you've gone where there are more fish because of marine protected areas?
Unfortunately, very few. I think that the Alaska fishery to me is, for salmon's one of the only sustainable ones. That's because they don't allow salmon farms and they have the hatcheries. But I think almost every commercial fishery worldwide is in a state of collapse. There's just simply too many people and not enough fish. And on top of that, you have factors like pollution, everything from plastic pollution, noise pollution, chemical pollution. All of these things are contributing toward diminishment of life in the sea. And it's becoming more and more of a serious problem every single year. And that's why it requires activism, and not just activism on the part of NGOs, but activism on the part of world governments. They got to get off their ass and start going out there and protecting the ocean. And if they don't, then the ocean's going to die. And it's as simple as that.
And when you're on the high seas...
Can I?
Go ahead, sure. Rashid Soumaila.
Yeah, can I quickly add, just to your question, I mean, if the marine protected area is properly protected, usually we see more fish in there, and it's very useful. And the evidence of that is actually, you will see people fishing. Is it fishing along the line or is it fishing on the line? You will see boats actually lining up at the boundary of the marine protected area, because that's where the good, big, valuable fish are. If you protect it well and you give it time. So there are some community marine protected areas that have actually shown big increases in biomass because they are well protected.
All right, how to raise awareness, to get land lovers to play the long game on preserving the oceans. Sunday was World Ocean Day, and the Chicago White Sox baseball team enrolled the services of Pepe the Penguin, the resident of the Brookfield Zoo, on the field for the ceremonial first pitch of the game against the Kansas City Royals. Alexei Povilevich, I see you making a face. You're not into the idea of Pepe the Penguin.
Really, I mean, an aquarium, a modern aquarium, is an informal education institution. We don't want to play with animals. We use animals to raise awareness. And each and every time I see an animal used by a baseball team to show anything, that's not its natural habitat. It is not, I mean, animal welfare is not respected there. Imagine the noise in the stadium, the light. This poor bird should go back to its place. It's just, no, that's not a good idea at all.
All right. Paul Watson, I'll ask you this question again before we go. Are there areas where, out in the open sea, where you have gone, where you've noticed that because of action, because of protection, there is more fauna, there is more, right now, more marine life?
Because of our interventions in the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary, over 6,500 whales were not killed. And that gives me a lot of pleasure to know that they're still swimming out there. And also the fact that the Japanese have retreated, for now, from the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary. So that is one area that is protection. And now we're also working on creating a South Atlantic sanctuary for whales, too. So that's the good news, if you ask me. The problem with marine protection areas that I have found out there is that's where the poachers go, because that's where they know they're going to find the fish, because as fish become diminished more and more, they're going to go to those areas. The Galapagos National Park, where I've spent quite some time working with the park rangers, I'd say about 600,000 sharks every year are taken out of that national park illegally, because we simply don't have the enforcement abilities to stop these huge Chinese vessels that come in there and just take everything they want.
All right, and certainly that's on the agenda at this conference in Nice. Paul Watson, I want to thank you for being with us from Nice. I want to thank Julia Tass and Rachid Soumaila as well for joining us from that United Nations conference. Alexis Povilevich, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.